If only my mind would stop talking. Jake stared at the ceiling in the dark, drenched in sweat and doubt. The fan above spun lazily, mimicking the storm of thoughts circling in his head. What if I fail again? Why can't I be like the others? Did I forget something important? His body lay still, but inside a war was raging. Every moment of silence was louder than the last. Even when surrounded by people, Jake felt alone, because his mind was never truly with him. It was either buried in regrets of yesterday or drowning in the fears of tomorrow. Jake was 22, a university student with sharp potential but shattered focus. Despite his talent, his grades dropped. His relationships were shallow. He missed deadlines, avoided conversations, and carried an invisible weight everywhere. And the worst part? No one saw it, because Jake didn't look broken. He looked normal. But inside, every wasted thought felt like a punch to his soul. One evening, Jake received an email. "You are at risk of academic suspension." His hands trembled. This was it, the moment his fears were no longer imaginary. He sat motionless for hours, replaying every mistake he'd ever made. You never finish anything. You're always distracted. You'll never make it. By morning, he couldn't eat, couldn't think, couldn't move. His mind had officially turned against him. That afternoon, he visited the only person who ever seemed to make sense of life. His grandfather, Papa Joe, a man whose silence spoke louder than others' speeches. Jake didn't even need to explain. One look at his face and Papa Joe handed him a glass of water, gesturing toward the old garden bench. They sat side by side, watching leaves fall like they had for decades. "Your mind," Papa Joe finally said, "is like this garden." Jake glanced at the withering plants and the thick weeds. "It wasn't always like this," he replied, shoulders low. "No," the old man nodded, "but you stopped tending to it." Papa Joe began to tell a story, one Jake hadn't heard before. There was once a warrior, known not for his strength, but for his mind. Every morning, before lifting his sword, he'd sit by the river and train his thoughts. He called it his mental sharpening. He'd isolate every fear, every doubt, every assumption, and either discard it or reframe it. But one season, he skipped his ritual. He was too tired, too distracted. Soon, the warrior began to lose battles. Not because he wasn't strong, but because he couldn't hear his instincts through the noise in his mind. So he returned to the river. This time, he stared into the water and whispered, "Show me the enemy I've been fighting." And the river answered back, "It's you." Jake sat frozen, the metaphor slicing through the fog in his head. "So, what happened to the warrior?" he finally asked. "He became still," Papa Joe said, "and then he started again, one thought at a time." Jake didn't change overnight, but that story became his ritual. Every morning he began journaling 3 types of thoughts: wasted thoughts, fears, doubts, comparisons, useful thoughts, ideas, lessons, plans, neutral thoughts, noise, distractions. And just like a gardener, he began pulling weeds. When a negative thought emerged, he'd whisper to himself, "Is this thought helping me or hurting me?" If it hurt, he challenged it or let it pass. He started meditating, not to empty his mind, but to observe it, like the warrior by the river. He trained focus like a muscle, 10 minutes, then 20, then hours where he could study, speak, and sleep without the noise dominating everything. His grades improved, his confidence returned. But the biggest shift wasn't external. It was the silence, not the absence of thought, but the control over it. He realized he'd spent years renting space in his head to thoughts that never paid rent. 1 year later, Jake stood at the same bench beside Papa Joe. "I never thought my mind could change," he said. Papa Joe smiled. "That's because you never learned how to train it." Jake chuckled. "And now, you've become the warrior." He looked at the horizon and breathed deeply. The thoughts still came, but now they bowed to him. He had learned that adversity wasn't just in the world. It was often a reflection of an untrained mind. And just like any battlefield, victory belonged to those who prepared before the war. Moral of the story: the thoughts you allow define the life you create. Train your mind not to silence every noise, but to choose which voice you obey. Because the real war is never outside, it's within.